11 hands went up inside the United Nations Security Council. Then China said no. That was the moment. Not a missile launch, not a tanker explosion, not a presidential speech, a room, a vote, a veto, and almost nobody understood what they were actually looking at. Because on the surface, the story looks simple. The resolution was about the Strait of Hormuz, the route was under pressure, the world wanted transit restored, China and Russia vetoed. Therefore, the easy conclusion was ready immediately. China is protecting Iran. That is the headline version. I think the real story is much bigger and much more dangerous. The real story is not that China wanted to defend Iran emotionally. The real story is that China refused to let the Strait of Hormuz be reopened under a framework of American force and American legitimacy. That is the whole argument. Not Iran first, not morality first, control first. Because once Hormuz is reopened by the United States, with the blessing of the Security Council, the meaning of the whole crisis changes. It is no longer simply a shipping problem solved. It becomes proof that Washington still decides who gets to use the world's most important energy corridor. And under what rules, and from Beijing's point of view, that is the one outcome that mattered most to prevent. Now let me slow this down, because the details of the resolution sounded harmless on paper, restore freedom of transit through the Strait of Hormuz. If you hear that once, quickly, it sounds like the most reasonable sentence in the world. Of course, the route should reopen. Of course, shipping should resume. Of course, markets want stability. But hidden inside the early language was the phrase all necessary means. And in diplomacy, that phrase is never decorative. It means force, it means escalation, it means military action with legal cover. So the real issue before the Security Council was never just transit. The real issue was whether the United States and its partners would receive international legitimacy to use force in and around Hormuz under a UN frame. That is why several countries pushed back before the final vote. China pushed back, Russia pushed back, even France pushed back. The text was revised, then revised again. The force language was diluted, the path to open military authority was softened, and still China and Russia vetoed it. That tells you something important. This was never just a dispute over wording. It was a dispute over what world would exist after the wording became action. Because if that resolution had passed, even in a softened form, America would have gained something far more valuable than one successful vote. It would have gained legitimacy, not just power with approval. It would have meant that the United Nations Security Council, the highest legal stage in the international system, had effectively blessed the U.S., led reopening of the most important energy choke point on Earth. And once that happens, the whole message of the crisis changes. The message is no longer merely that shipping resumed. The message is that even now, after years of decline talk, debt, failed wars, and overstretch, the United States still decides who gets access to critical energy corridors and who does not. That matters enormously to China. Because from Beijing's point of view, the nightmare is not simply expensive oil. The nightmare is dependency on a maritime order enforced by the U.S. Navy. Dependency on a world where, at any point, American force backed by international legitimacy can determine whether Chinese economic life moves freely or under permission. Chinese strategists have worried about versions of this problem for decades. The most famous version is the Malacca dilemma, the fear that the United States can choke China's economy by controlling a handful of narrow passages. Now, imagine that same strategic vulnerability reinforced at Hormuz. Not just American sea power with UN approval attached to it. That is not a short-term inconvenience. That is a strategic nightmare. And once you understand that, the Chinese veto stops looking irrational. In fact, it becomes the most rational move available. Because if America reopens Hormuz under its own force and under international legal cover, China loses something much bigger than temporary price relief. It loses ground in the long struggle over strategic dependence. Now go one layer deeper. What happens if Hormuz does not reopen quickly? On the surface, China gets hurt, prices rise, supply chains tighten, uncertainty spreads through markets. That part is true. But China does not think in quarterly pain. China thinks in structural change. And from that perspective, prolonged instability in Hormuz does something very important. It puts stress on the financial system built around Gulf energy flows. To understand that, you have to understand the petrodollar system. For decades, global oil trade, especially in the Gulf, has run overwhelmingly through the US dollar. That means countries need dollars to buy energy. That constant demand helps sustain demand for American debt, American assets, and the wider financial architecture of US power. So the dollar is not just a currency. It is one of the hidden foundations of the American empire. Now ask what happens when one of the most important energy routes in the world stays unstable. Exports become harder to move. The old cycle of oil dollars and recycled American financial dominance begins to strain. Countries start asking uncomfortable questions. What if this system is less reliable than we thought? What if the maritime order behind it is now a source of risk rather than security? What if alternatives are no longer theoretical? This is where China's long preparation matters. Yuan-based energy settlements, alternative payment rails, Belt and Road financial architecture, deeper integration with Russia and Iran. These mechanisms do not replace the dollar in a stable world, but in a stressed world, they become much more attractive. That is why the veto is not just about one waterway, it is about the system attached to that waterway. China was willing to absorb short-term pain because long-term stress on the old order may be far more valuable. Now, there is another layer people keep underestimating. A lot of analysts say, fine, but China still needs the oil. China still gets hurt. That means this cannot be a real strategy. Yes, China gets hurt, but only if you imagine China is improvising. China is not improvising. China has spent years building buffers for exactly this kind of disruption: strategic petroleum reserves, diversified suppliers, overland corridors, the China-Pakistan economic corridor, deeper logistical links with Russia and Iran, massive domestic investment in nuclear, solar, wind, and grid resilience. This is not just energy policy, it is shock absorption policy. It is China building an economy that can take maritime stress better than many of its rivals. So when Hormuz becomes unstable, China does not experience pure panic. It experiences a painful but manageable stress test. And when you compare that with other economies, the contrast matters. Europe is deeply exposed. Japan is deeply exposed. South Korea is deeply exposed. Many US allies have fewer buffers, fewer alternatives, and less political tolerance for sustained energy pain. So the longer the crisis lasts, the more valuable China's preparation becomes. That changes the balance of power. Now we move to the narrative layer, and this is exactly where the global chessboard gets larger. China argued that the resolution did not address the root causes of the crisis. Russia made a similar point. Maybe you agree with that framing, maybe you do not. That is not even the most important issue. The important issue is that this argument resonates far beyond Beijing and Moscow across much of Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Many governments and publics have watched the same pattern for decades: intervention first, justification later, force described as order, rules applied selectively, depending on who is acting and who is being acted upon. So when China vetoes a resolution like this, it is not only making a geopolitical move, it is making a narrative move. It is telling a large part of the non-Western world, we will not automatically legitimize force under a system many of you already believe is selectively applied, that is politically valuable. It helps China present itself not merely as a rising power, but as a critic of selective enforcement and a defender of sovereignty language that resonates strongly outside the Western alliance system. And in geopolitics, narrative power matters. Wars are not fought only with missiles. They are fought with stories. Who is escalating? Who is defending? Who is bending the rules? Who is protecting them? That battlefield matters because perception shapes alignment and alignment shapes power. Now step back and take the largest view of all. What happened in the Security Council was not just about Hormuz. It was about the world system. For years, people have talked about the transition from a unipolar world to a multipolar world as if it were still theory. It is not theory anymore. The veto made it visible. Because what China and Russia demonstrated with one decision was brutally simple. The Security Council is not America's rubber stamp anymore. There was a time, especially after the Cold War, when Washington could move through international institutions with extraordinary freedom. Russia was weak. China had not yet risen enough to contest the structure directly. That era is over. America went to the unseeking legitimacy for what it framed as a vital stabilization move. It did not get it, not because of technical procedure, not because of delay, but because two major powers looked at the proposal and said, no, that is a structural shift. It means there are now visible limits on what the United States can authorize through the old institutional order. And once you understand that, the crisis looks different. This is not just a dispute over one vote. It is a signal that the old world order no longer moves automatically when Washington pushes the button. Now let me give you the real path tree, because this is where the strategy becomes clear. If China had voted yes, America would have gained legal cover, strategic prestige, and a stronger claim to maritime control. If China voted no, Beijing would absorb some short-term energy pain, but it would deny Washington legitimacy, prolong stress on the old order, and increase the value of the alternatives China has been building for years. Those were the real choices. And from Beijing's point of view, the second path was obviously better. That is why the veto happened. Now let me address the biggest counter-argument. People say this cannot last forever. Eventually, China must want Hormuz reopened. That is true. Eventually, everybody wants the route functioning. But that is not the strategic question. The strategic question is this: who runs out of time first? And here the answer becomes uncomfortable for Washington. America is burning through time faster than China is. The United States is spending political capital, investor confidence, alliance patience, domestic tolerance, and military stockpiles. None of those things are infinite. Every week of instability increases pressure inside the American system. Iran, by contrast, has built its strategic culture around endurance. China has built its economic system around buffers. So delay itself becomes a weapon, and that is what the veto really, it did not solve the crisis. It stretched it. It denied Washington a fast institutional victory. It forced time to keep running. And in this kind of struggle, the side better prepared for attrition often gains more from delay than from speed. That is why so many analysts are still misunderstanding this moment. They are treating it like a conventional military contest. It is not. It is a struggle over systems, endurance, legitimacy, and the shape of the next world order. Iran is fighting for survival. America is fighting for credibility. China is fighting for something even bigger: the gradual erosion of a U.S.-dominated world system that has constrained China's rise for decades. And what makes the Chinese move so significant is that it advanced that objective at almost no direct military cost. No fleet battle, no missiles, no troops. Just one diplomatic weapon used at the exact moment Washington most needed a yes. That is what a veto really is at great power level, not procedure. A strategic weapon in legal form. It can delay, deny, frustrate, and redirect the direction of a crisis without firing a shot. That is why this moment matters so much. Years from now, historians may not say the turning point was a bombing campaign or a naval maneuver. They may say it was the day China looked at the United States, looked at the Security Council, and with one word changed the direction of the entire crisis. That is why I think everybody missed the real story. The veto was not hesitation. It was not confusion. It was not China simply protecting Iran. It was a deliberate move to block Hormuz from being reopened under the combined framework of American force and American legitimacy. And once you see that, the whole crisis looks different, because this was never just about reopening a waterway. It was about who gets to define the rules of the world that comes after the old one starts to crack.